And I will welcome you all to what is our 75th Running Online Sports Economics Seminar. Seminars that we've been running since pretty much the start of the pandemic, at least as it hit the West in March last year, and carrying on as we head into the second winter of the pandemic. Hopefully when we emerge in the spring, we'll be doing things a little bit more in person. But until we get to that point, and so long as there is demand and supply for these talks, I'll be more than happy to continue to provide them. This week we have two PhD students from the University of Tübingen. We have Lukas Fischer and Nagel, who are going to be presenting their work, which is entitled, if I find the title, Modeling Behavioural Responses to Emotional Cues in Sports, a Bayesian Approach. Now, before we get going, last week I shared a couple of calls for papers for conferences in Gijón, and there's still one of those is still live for the conference in December in Gijón. But Alex Gillette got in touch with a call for papers of his own, which I put in the team. So do have a look at that, and I'm going to share my screen just to show you the document. So it's called for papers, the origins and evolution of professional football clubs from a management and organisational perspective. So Alex apologises that it's football related, but basically it's the European Business History Association 2022 Congress, which will hopefully be in Madrid in Spain. Hopefully we're back to meeting in person by then. And Alex Gillette plus Kevin Tennant, who both presented in the Roses series a couple of months ago, are organising this session along with Thomas from the University of Barcelona. Alex is on the call, so do feel free to reach out to him if you do want to, and you can see that there's an abstract is the way of submitting, and submit by the 31st of December.
I've got to be honest at this point, and Thomas, who wrote this, has called me and Kevin both professor, and maybe in Barcelona we would be, but we're senior lecturer in the UK language. I don't want anyone thinking I was being pretentious. I didn't write that. It was an honour bestowed upon me.
Okay, Alex, it could be a prediction for you know. So hope you're putting in your promotion application this year, Alex.
Will do. The fact that no one's questioned it is a good sign.
Absolutely, absolutely. And the one other thing to mention, since we're on a call and remind each other, I forget this deadline every year. The Royal Economic Society's annual conference deadline for papers is Sunday. So type in Royal Economic Society annual conference if you want to submit a paper to that. There will be regional hubs, different parts of the UK, but it will be online other than regional hubs, the Royal Economic Society conference for this year. But I don't want to hold up either Lucas or Michael any further, so please do take away your presentation, the two of you. I'm really looking forward to it.
Yes, all right, I'm going to share the screen. Okay, could you confirm that you see the presentation?
Yep, got it.
Okay, perfect. So thank you, James, for the introduction. So we are from the University of Tübingen. I'm Lukas Fischer from the Data Science and Sports Lab. Together with my colleagues, Professor Augustin Kelava, actually, Michael Nagel, from which you will hear later, and Professor Tim Pawlowski, we are interested in modeling behavioral responses to emotional cues in sports, and we do this as a Bayesian approach. In a nutshell, we are interested in whether deviations from certain reference points people might have might induce people to behave differently in a certain setting due to a utility gain or loss. And the whole project is funded by the Deutsche Forschungsgemeinschaft, DFG, so German Research Foundation, and we call this cluster of machine learning in Tübingen. So thank you for financing the project. All right, so let's dive in. The phenomenon we are looking at in our paper is alcohol. Alcohol as phenomenon is pretty interesting. We will hear about that in a minute. For now, just look at this figure of beer sales over the 90-minute period of a exemplary match between VfB Stuttgart and SC Freiburg from 2019. VfB Stuttgart is a first division German soccer team, and we got the data from them to, which makes our analysis possible in the first place. You can see, yes, people decide to consume alcohol during the match, and this is the most important takeaway right at the start, because often when we present our project and our idea to others, they always argue, okay, there's not going on anything during the match, people are just watching the game. No, it's not the case. As you can see, there is a downward slope during the first half of the first half, yeah, exactly. Then it goes up again. It peaks in the second half, the consumption obviously, and then it goes down. Maybe because matches get more interesting at the end of the time period. We will see about that. And the setting is rather complex. So we have multiple levels of data. For example, we have a match-specific part and a time and match-specific part. So we're going to look at hierarchical modeling. And this is the reason why we need to apply some machine learning techniques. Of course, there's regularization, meaning that we prevent overfitting by not allowing parameters to float around or get too high. Also, we have to develop and especially look at the finite sample properties of some priors. In the Bayesian context, you have some prior distributions for your parameters. Then you get a posterior distribution for each parameter. And obviously, what you put in decides heavily on the result. So, for example, if you assume a normal distribution, the posterior will be a normal distribution, but the mean and the variance are shifted around. This is exactly what we are looking at in the results. And another machine learning approach would be imputation, because the data on our odds we are using, our in-play odds, is not perfect, not complete. So we need to apply, in this case, a recurrent neural network to impute these missing values. Let's continue with the literature, or our path we are contributing to. In the basis forms prospect theory. I call this slide prospect theory's heritage because it's a lot of work has been done since then. So prospect theory in a nutshell is losers loom larger than gains. So for the gains, people are assumed to have a concave utility function, whereas in the negative quadrant, for the losses, they assume to have a convex utility function, and in the negative part, the slope is way steeper than in the concave part, which puts prospect theory in a nutshell. A lot of empirical evidence is there. There's this common professor example. They're giving away a pen and a cup, for example, for each $5 during the lecture. And then they ask the students to trade this stuff or to sell them. Which price would you sell it at, and stuff like that. And you see that people tend to hold on what they have and give a higher value to that object. And also, if they if they sell, they would sell it only for a higher price than these $5, even if it would be rational to do otherwise. And you also can see this in a bigger setting when you're looking at house prices, for example, because there's a this loss aversion in the utility function. Then there's this important statement here, where the literature we are contributing to is based on, Kostic and Rabin from 2006, utility from deviations between rationally expected reference points and actual outcomes influences behavior and uncertainty. I think the most important fact is this one here, rationally expected references, and why it is important you will see later on when we talk about our reference points. Now I want to continue with the field evidence of this reference-dependent behavior and sports, because here we find our study, at least the first study part in our project is about two parts. The first part is this behavioral sports economic stuff, and then second part is more of a methodological contribution. There are lots of papers. I just want to emphasize a few. For example, there's Mary 2016. In this paper, they're using football data, and the essence is that violent behavior increases only during derbies. G et al. From 2021 kind of confirms that result. Then we have this study from 2013. These guys show that there's an increase in robberies, while thefts stay constant if there's an upset loss. So also looking at football, if there's an upset loss for a certain team. And Cardendall is another interesting study here in this context. He shows a significant impact on family violence for upset losses. And this paper is the last one I want to emphasize, Lin et al. From 2018. They look at American football, college football to be precise, and find that upset wins increase excessive partying, alcohol consumption, and even rapes that were reported at the match day. To have a conclusion of this field evidence, you can read up Pawlowski 2021, and there's a well-written overview of all the literature. Let's continue what the motivation of our project was and still is. Alcohol as a phenomenon is, I think, we can not argue about that, an important and interesting phenomenon in our society. So Griswold et al., for example, published in Lancet, they show that is a key driver, alcohol is a key driver for death and disability. Klosterman and all, Fall Stewart, they also show interesting effects on behavior. Seaman and Siemens, for example, they go in this stress dampening direction, where they argue that people, when they feel powerless, they might to get drinks or to consume alcohol because of the stress dampening effects. This is the phenomenon, and on the methodological side, we are interested in this longitudinal multi-level time series modeling. There are three important papers in this regard. Aspurov, 2016 A and B. So he introduced in his first paper the so-called DLCA, dynamic latent class analysis. And in his second paper, he introduced the DSEM, dynamic structural equation modeling. To those who are not familiar with these two approaches, I would like to give an intuition. So the first paper, this DLCA, dynamic latent class analysis, focuses around the states people can be in. For example, you might think about a college student that has the intention to drop out from college, and he switches between these states. So the dynamic in the word DLCA means something with time series. So there is dynamics going on. Then you have latent class. This class is hidden because this is from a psychological point of view. They have latent classes people can be in, and they use indicator variables, for example, in questionnaires or surveys, whatever, to model these latent classes. And these latent classes have an impact on the parameter estimates. Then in this paper, he reported the, as I told you already, DSEM, so dynamic structural equation modeling. Structural equation modeling in general is more a framework than a technique. So it's good to think about it as a system of relationships. And he proposed a way to have this dynamic, this whole structural equation modeling. And then our supervisor, Professor Kelava, together with the new Professor Brandt, also University of Tübingen, they put together these both approaches to have a NDLC SEM, so non-linear dynamic latent class structural equation modeling. And this model is what we are using in our project. However, we do not use each possible part of the model because it's very complex and flexible. You can do anything with it. You just need to pick the parts you really need for your analysis. All right. Now I'm going to continue with the measures. What are the key variables in our setting? The key variables for us are the so-called emotional cues. They were proposed by Eli et al. In 2015, and the exact specification we are using in the football context is based on Behavioural et al. 2020. The first one you can see is shock. Shock means you just subtract the outcome probability in match minute t for a certain path. Let's do it for home. We sum over all paths. Home, draw, away, win. After that, but let's focus on home first. You just subtract the probability in t for home minus the probability at the beginning of the match. Then you square the whole thing. You sum over these two packages, these squared packages, and then you take the square root. Shock was introduced by Behavioural et al. To be honest, the theoretical foundation is not as deep as for the other two, surprise and suspense. However, we include shock in our model because it could be that people are seeing this pre-match probability or the pre-match reference point still as relevant for their behavior. Now, surprise is a little bit different, but as well a backward-looking measure because you just compare the probability, outcome probability in t for each path and the probability in the match minute before. I would like to emphasize at this point the square root. Behavioural et al., to be honest, is very short on this. We're summing over the paths and taking the square root. If we stay close to Eli et al., we can think about this being a utility function square root of x. So we implicitly imply that people gain utility from shock or surprise because it is just more interesting to watch them. And then there's suspense. Suspense is a little bit more difficult to calculate. It's not as trivial if you have in-play odds as the other two measures because it's a forward-looking measure. So it's driven by the variance in the next period. If the variance in the next period is high, so a lot of things can happen, then suspense is high. We have the square root of x as well, so we're implying that people enjoy suspense generally. And let's look at this formula, how we can calculate it. So we need the probability in t+1, the outcome probability for each path, for example, a home win, given that home scores in match minute t+1. And for that purpose, we need to have a simulation process where we rely on historical empirical goal distributions, and then we can simulate each possible outcome, 2-1, 3-1, whatever, and ask the question, what would be if? So what would be if away scores goal and the probability that away wins, and so on. The contribution we have with regard to the Behavioural paper is that we use a multivariate Poisson distribution to draw the rates the goals are happening from, and we also use the over and unders from multiple bookmakers to get rid of idiosyncrasies. Okay, so that's the part of the measures. That's our key variables, and last but not least, a short graphical intuition about what these cues mean in the context of a football match. So I think it's pretty clear that, for example, if you looked at surprise, that these measures react to important key events, match key events like red cards or goals. For example, you have a home goal here, you have a away goal here, you have a red card against VfB Stuttgart here. And also what you can see is that suspense is slightly increasing during the end of the match when the revelation is there. So when the match ends, then everything is set in stone and the revelation comes in. So this is a typical pattern for suspense. Shock, is rather spiky, but similar to the surprise, but the beliefs are not updated, as I told you before, because you're relying on this pre-match outcome probability in this case. Right, then I will give it to Michael, who tells you something about our data, the model specification, and shows the empirical results. If there are no questions, Michael, so do you want?
I think. Yeah, okay. Thanks, Lukas, and also again thanks to Professor Reade for having me today. I think there are no questions so far, so otherwise just let us know. I will now continue with the data, then I will go through the methodology part, and last but not least I will present the data. The results, of course. Now our data consists of 3 distinct pools or data sets. The first one is the transaction data set, which covers second-by-second beer and shandy sales that are recorded in the stadium of the club for all stands except for the away team fan block. And this data comes from the data department of VfB Stuttgart. The second data set is the sports betting market data set, which covers match in-play odds on a minute-by-minute base, as well as the closing odds. The in-play odds come from Nagel, and the closing odds were extracted from odds portal. The third and the last data set refers to the match key events and match day information, and covers information about goals and red cards with timestamp, and also some match-specific information like the current season, the week date during which the game was played, and also minute-by-minute weather data like the temperature, precipitation, or air pressure, and so forth. All right. So now the total number of transactions that are associated with either beer or shandy drinks in the stadium amounts to 658,000 transactions. And the number of items scanned within the scope of these transactions is 780,000 for beer and about 76,000 for shandy. And at this point, I also want to mention that we imputed the missing in-play odds, which either are missing occasionally, so just randomly, or systematically. which is often the case towards the end of the match, when the match is pre-decided and bookmakers do not longer offer any betting odds. And we predicted these odds using a recurrent neural network, which uses the past or the game history as information, as well as information about the current score, red cards, and the elapsed time. All right. Now this slide offers just a few descriptives about the data. Now this slide has the average or the accumulated alcohol sales for each match. You can see that we have 98 home matches in our data set from the seasons 2013-14 to 2018-19. On average, 7,600 beers and 778 shandy drinks were sold per match, with a quite large standard deviation of 2,500 beers and about 400 shandy drinks. The minimum number of beers is 2,600, and for shandy 190. And in the maximum in the game with the maximum number of beers sold, 14,000 items were scanned for beer and 2,000 for shandy. Right, and on the bottom right of the slide, you can see the graphical representation of the just presented data. These are so-called violin plots. It's quite easy to understand. The colored area refers to the kernel density estimate. So it's just a kernel, and the white dot in the middle of the violin is the mean, while the fat black bar is the interquantile range, and the thin black bar relates to the so-called whiskers. And the whiskers are, let's put it differently, so the area of the kernel which is not covered by those whiskers is suggested by the plot to be outliers, right? Okay. So now the same descriptives for the beer sales on a per minute base. You can see that we have 8,820 observations in total, so which results from 98 matches with 90 observations each. On average, 85 beers and 9 shandy drinks were consumed during a minute, with a standard deviation of 52 and 8 respectively. There are some minutes or a few minutes where 0 beers and 0 shandy drinks were consumed, and the maximum number of beer and shandy is 283 and 68 respectively. Okay. Right. Then we can continue with the preliminary methods and model. Our model starts with a simple decomposition of our alcohol sales YIT into the two orthogonal components, Y1IT and Y2I. So the first component, Y1IT, is the match and time-specific component of the sales, while Y2I is the purely match-specific part, right? And I in this context refers to the match ID, and T to the minute of the match. Yeah, and also I think it's also worth mentioning that we instead of regarding minute-by-minute observations, we clustered or we accumulated the data in 5 minutes intervals, such that the first observation relates to the accumulated sales of minutes 1 to 5, the second to 6 to 10, and so forth and so forth. I think you got the intuition. Okay. Yeah, from this decomposition of our alcohol sales, we get the following. We got a random effect hierarchical model with 2 levels. The first one is the so-called within level, and here our match and sales and match and time specific component is regressed on a constant V1I and a set of match and time-specific covariates x1it, which are listed below. So these comprise lag-dependent variables, a dummy for the half, the precipitation during the match, our emotional cues, shock, surprise, and suspense, the current temperature, trends, as well as water consumption in order to control for the baseline consumption in this minute in the stadium, right? And for all these variables, except for the trends and the half, we consider two lags. So this means that we allow the last 15 minutes in the regression to have an effect of the current 5 minutes window. So remember, we grouped the observations in 5 minutes intervals. So if we investigate the window or the interval of the minutes 10 to 15, then lag 1 refers to the minutes 5 to 9. So this is the idea. And right, the second level is so-called between level. And here, very importantly, we request the level 1 intercept V1i on another intercept, V2, which represents the grand mean of our model, plus a set of purely match-specific features or variables. Yeah, these are, amongst others, the average precipitation and temperature during the match, the competition to which the match belongs, the month, the ranks of the home and away team, the seasons, number of spectators, weekday, and so forth and so forth. And in total, these are 41 variables. Yeah, and then what else? I think I also have to mention that we separately investigate the data for beer and shandy. So we separate beer and shandy in the regression. And as I already said, we observed the whole sales of the total stadium except for the away team fan block. But in principle, our model would also be capable of investigating not only different alcohol types like beer and shandy, but in addition we could have a look at the effects within different stands or even fan blocks. All right. Now this is the model viewed graphically. First, we have to recapitulate that when doing Bayesian estimation, we have to choose prior distributions for all our variables. In the optimal case, these priors can be inferred or at least guided by theoretical or statistical considerations. Like we, for example, know that the probability is defined to be between 0 and 1, or variance has to be larger than 0. Unfortunately, we don't have such information from theory, so we have to choose weakly informative priors, and for our purpose, we use we start with the normal distribution for the error terms, the intercepts and the slopes, and for the residual variance of y, we use a gamma distribution. All right, and yeah, I think it makes sense if we go through the structure. I mentioned before that V2 is the grand mean of our model. This is a scalar, so a single value, and together with epsilon2, which is a 98 times 1 vector of random draws from the normal distribution, this builds the random intercept of our model, meaning that we allow each match in our regression to have a different intercept, so a different baseline alcohol consumption, but we keep the slopes fixed. So we assume that the effect of suspense, for example, is the same for all matches or in all matches, and the intercepts can vary. Okay, and then it is worth mentioning that we engineered our feature space K2, so our purely match-specific features, as follows. In the first step, we blow up the feature space using the deep learning library sklearn with polynomial features, and we use this library to generate all feasible interaction terms of these 41 baseline covariates, and squares and cubic terms for all of these variables. And this results in a dramatically blown up feature space of 95,000 features. And in the second step, we use dimensionality reduction, UMAP, which is loosely speaking the nonlinear equivalent to principal component analysis, in order to compress this data set back to only 10 so-called embeddings, which should, in theory, explain the variance of this large data set. And the idea of this is just that we because there is no guidance from theory, and we want to make sure that to have the dimensionality and complexity required to capture the structure. Therefore, we first get extremely complex, and then we condense everything down to the main essence. All right. So then we can move on to the results. So this slide offers a graphical representation of our emotional cues, shock, surprise, and suspense, at the example of one leg. And you can see that shock, here the distribution, or the posterior, covers both the negative and the positive region. So we cannot conclude any positive or negative significant effect for shock. On the other hand, surprise seems to be clearly positive significant. So 100% of the distribution lies in the positive orthant, and the mean value is 8.2, and the 90% highest density interval HDI, which you can conceive of as the Bayesian equivalent to confidence bounds, indicates that 90% of the probability mass lies between 4.5 and 12. Right, and for suspense, we have a negatively significant effect. The mean is -18. Only 1.7% of the probability mass is larger than 0, and the 90% HDI ranges from -32 to -3.8. Okay, then we can have a look at the results in table form. So first of all, the R hat, so the column to the right, indicates that every variable has converged. So a value of the R hat smaller than 1.1 indicates full convergence, while values larger 1.1 suggest you should increase the sample size. And yeah, we can see that past alcohol consumption, beer home L1 and beer home L2, is correlated with current beer consumption. The half, or the second half, is there is less consumption going on. Precipitation seems to have seems to play a minor role for current beer sales. Shock is also insignificant, and then the instant effect of surprise is clearly negative. So it ranges somewhere between -10 and -2. And then if we like it, sorry, the sign turns to be positive. And one possible explanation for this phenomenon maybe goes back to the key drivers of surprise, which are the gold scored and the red cards issued. And these are major in-play events, and human behavior in the stadium when a major in-play event took place is that they do not immediately run to the cash point and go buying beer, but they first stay on their seats and rejoice or complain about the goal, depending on which team they support. Maybe they also watch the game in the repetition if a screen is available, and only then they go to the cash point. So this could be the story for surprise. And for suspense, we can see so the instant effect of suspense is maybe positive, but not clearly. The lagged once effect is clearly negative. And for lag 2, we see a rather positive, significant effect for suspense. So besides, we can see that temperature is negatively related to alcohol sales. The linear trend is positive, the cubic trend negative, the square trend also negative, and water consumption does also play an important role for the beer consumption. All right. So yeah, now what you can see on this slide is a so-called posterior predictive check, which is in principle a great way to validate your model. And the idea of posterior predictive checks are that you use your model to generate data from it by using draws from your posteriors. And you do this 10,000 times or 1 million times if you want. And this generates the blue thin lines. Then you can average it, take the mean, and compare it to the observed data distribution, which is the black curve. And we can infer from this graph that our model approximates the global structure of the true distribution, but fails to locally resemble every part of the distribution. All right. So then we also have a second specification of our model where we change the normal priors, and there we use a regularization prior, the so-called adaptive Bayesian lasso with spike and slap prior. And the idea of this prior is to reduce overfitting, of course, and it works as follows. It shrinks all coefficients that seem to play a minor role for the dependent variable towards 0, but still allow the more relevant variables to escape this shrinkage, right? And you can see this mechanism nicely if you regard shock. So the distribution become very spiky and almost degenerated. And yeah, first surprise, the distribution also got more spiky. But so I think the story is the same. So 100% of the probability mass is larger than 0. However, for suspense, the distribution now became rather diffuse. So we lost our negative effect of suspense. Okay, so this is the table. Here you can also nicely see that the seemingly unnecessary variables, or the variables which play not that big role for the alcohol sales, are all shrunk towards 0. So precipitation, shock, the linear trend, and unfortunately always also suspense. However, the reason why suspense got shrunk towards 0 could also be that we chose two aggressive hyperparameters. So maybe we can adapt on this, right? And I think the other coefficients roughly stay the same. Okay, and then for completeness, the posterior predictive check for this model, it looks virtually identical. So the ABSS lasso prior is still a, let's say, a valid alternative that one can consider. All right, so that was it from me. Then I pass it back to Lukas, who continues with the discussion and I think also further steps.
Thanks, Michael. Before we continue with the discussion, I would like to emphasize at this point that the main takeaway from this model specification and the project itself is that we have objective measures for these emotional cues and real observed data on alcohol consumption or phenomenon, so there's no survey data involved. Let's start with the limitations. So the model specification is not directly suggested by theory, it's rather inductive, our approach. As economists, our preferred solution is that we have a theory developed over several decades, and then the econometric guys can test whether the model or test whether the model fits the data. But however, you can never say a model is true. A model is only, let's say, a very trivial part or a very small part of reality. But in our case, there's no suggestions, and this is the reason why we need to keep the model flexible, not to impose too much structure with our priors and so on. So this is the first main limitation here. Then we have no data about these mobile salesmen, beer runners, if you like. So there are mobile salesmen that sell beer during the match. However, we talked about that with some guys from the club. So at this point, we are not worried that this might change the analysis because the sales are rather insignificant to the big numbers we implying here, and it's another reason to go for the whole home fans, the whole stadium, excluding this away fan block, to have less outlier issues in this rather small sample. Then we are not controlling the changing number of spectators during the game. This might be problematic. However, Michael told you that we have this baseline water consumption in, and this variable is more than it seems at first glance, because what are you controlling is a lot more than just this water, this baseline consumption. For example, this number of spectators during the game. So everything you do not have on the first level, so match and time specific, might be highly correlated, or a lot of the stuff you do not put in might be highly correlated with this variable. So we should be able to control for a lot of these issues, including water consumption, match, and time specific. Then there is no confounding political event dummies beside the Vasendummy, the Spring and Autumn Oktoberfest of Stuttgart. We implemented that because we have data on it. What could be a problem here? For example, if fans have are in a bad or good state, for example, right before the match, bad because there are some club political issues. Everyone hates the boss, and the management had some questionable decisions and so on. And especially for this club, VfB Stuttgart, this might be an issue. I can tell you about that because I'm a member. So trust me, there's a lot of political stuff going on. However, it stays open. If there's something we are not capturing right now, we are open for discussion there. So the next steps we are focusing on is the regularization and prior selection and the finite sample properties, especially with respect to this prior selection. So what does it mean? We try different priors. We may also imply a new prior that fits our needs better than the priors before. And we need to have like a simulation study to show how these priors react and work in a finite sample setting like this one. The next important thing, Michael told you about the legs in our baseline model, which are 2 legs right now, so capturing 15 minutes after important match key events like red cards or goals. Of course, you can change the interval to minute by minute or every 3 minutes or so, and then change the number of legs to capture the same time window, capture a longer time window. Maybe you can check the model specification by using information criteria. Right now, we're not completely sure about it. This baseline model seems to do the job. However, right now, I would like to ask you, for the wisdom of crowds effect, to write me a private message in the chat. What you think, how long does it take for a fan to react to these key match events like goals or red cards and then buy alcohol? So the time, what do you think, what is the time from reaction or trigger to the transaction? I will stop the presentation to give you a minute and then we will continue. All right. Anyone there?
We're still here, Lucas.
Okay.
People
Nice.
do want to message Lucas. You can hover over his name.
Exactly.
And it should allow you to send him a quick message with how long you think you might take to react.
Thanks. Okay, perfect. Then we will continue. You're invited to put your numbers in also right now. Beside the number of legs, we are still working on the improvement of the transformation of odds into outcome probabilities. Most of you are probably familiar with this normalization of odds. So roughly speaking, you take the bookmaker's margin and distribute it proportionally to the different outcomes. You can get efficient odds in some sense, but there's also a lot of improvement possible because what you're actually implying is that the bookmaker has a balanced book at each point in time, and also the like professional sports bettors can make use of the inefficiencies in the sports betting market. So this is only a very rough measure of outcome probabilities. Probably it depends, of course, how precise you wanna have it, and it's questionable whether this will change the results dramatically or not. But in any way, it's a good idea to look at the reference points, the rationally expected reference points, which are these outcome probabilities we're looking at, and then we calculate our measures from. So I think it's worth to dive in there. And yeah, then you have the refinement of recurrent neural network we're using right now for imputation. This is 1.5 years or 2 years ago we started with that, but yeah, there's always something to improve. And this dimensionality stuff, blow up the feature space, then reduces, extract the essence. Of course, we can dig in there. For example, yeah, robustness check with PCA is quickly done. Another idea would be autoencoding, where you have a network that starts with an input, then it becomes narrower, and then the task for the network is to rebuild the input with a lower number of features or nodes in this case. So would be an idea to have this level 2 feature space reduced to its essence. And yeah, then the last point I would like to mention is the spectator mood, because you can think about depending on the match and how everything goes, there might be different slopes for these measures, surprise, suspense, and shock. And so we try to make use of this NDLC SEM framework and define some states. The typical fan is in, and then he switches between these states, and we get different slopes and parameter estimates for each state. Now, thanks for your attention, and yeah, we're happy to hear your suggestions and to add them to the next steps chapter.
Great. Thank you very much, Lukas and Michael, for a really very interesting talk on alcohol consumption during football matches. Any questions and comments? While we wait, Carl expressed some surprise at the ratio of shandy to beer sales in your data. Because based on a UK perspective, that seems like quite a lot of shandy relative to beer. Cultural differences, perhaps.
Tim? Okay. I thought you would like to mention something.
Well, I mean, I can, but it's highly speculative, right? So what we received is the real scanner data at the different cache points, and this is what we observed, right, in terms of sold beverages. I mean, you can assume that a couple of people are drinking maybe a shandy after 10 beers, so then you could get the ratio. But yeah, at the end, we don't know. So we could double check with the manager of the arena, because they have the overall overview of sold beers, shandies, and so on. But it seems to be a kind of pretty normal or standard mixture across the different seasons.
Mm.
Yeah, it's pretty famous here, so I think people like to drink it here.
Yeah. Are those the only two options that are sold by the kiosks at the stadium, or are there more drinks options available?
No, there's a lot of stuff. So soft drinks and water, of course. Then these are only the alcoholic stuff that matters for us, because we want to distinguish that because of the alcoholic proportion. So there's also wine, for example, but nothing that seems to be like important, because we can add all these drinks to have a separate model running for all these J drinks we want to have in.
Okay, any questions, comments, please do raise your hand if you have a question or comment you'd like to make. Stefan.
Yes, that's really interesting, very fascinating data. And I'm sorry, I just have to say there is something just truly magnificent about the world in which Germans used advanced statistical methods to study beer consumption at football matches. I mean, that's just that's just perfect, just perfect. So really about a couple of questions. So first, I was wondering about towards the end of the game, you said that suspense is increasing, and you think suspense is significant in terms of determining the consumption of beer. But isn't the other point though that as you said, suspense is rising at the end of the game? Well, at the end of the game, I'm just less likely to buy a beer in the stadium because there isn't time to drink it anymore. So I've got to, I'm going to be leaving the stadium quite soon. And so isn't it hard to disentangle the suspense issue from just the end of the game issue and going to drink beer somewhere else? There's a truncation here in the beer consumption, which presumably is continued elsewhere after the game. And the other question is sort of, I suppose, I don't want to be mean exactly, but what's the so what about this? Okay, people drink beer at Stuttgart games, and there's this pattern of drinking beer which you can tie with some variables. What's the generalizability of this? I mean, is this I can imagine maybe this is for the marketing people and they how to sell beer in German stadiums, or is there some policy implication here? I mean, why in some sense, so why do we care?
Okay.
Yeah, thanks. First, thanks for this question. So maybe I just answer the first question. You correctly said that the general trend of suspense is that it decreases towards the end, but it heavily depends on the current score and the match situation. So if the score is 3-0, then suspense is very small. So because there is no suspense at all, and yeah, but you're right. It's hard to disentangle the general effects. We try to fix this problem using by including overall trends. So we include a linear trend, a squared and a cubic trend, and also we try to control for baseline consumption, because if people tend to leave the stadium towards the end, then we also would expect that the water consumption would proportionately decrease towards the end. So.
Yeah, if you control, I mean, this is the point. You have trends and you have these baseline consumption, other covariates, and if you control like in a clean way, then the pattern doesn't matter because you have it in your model. Then it's just the effect from suspense on alcohol, and all the stuff that is floating around you control for. Is this...
Maybe I can briefly comment, Stefan, thanks a lot. Maybe I can briefly comment on the second part, which is very important, of course, when you want to make a paper out of that. So what the hell do we care about it? Actually, the motivation was mainly rooted, as Lukas was saying at the very beginning, in the psychological literature on alcohol use, because there are a couple of papers who try to test general theories of drinking and relate emotional cues to drinking behavior. And what they were doing so far is they were trying to generate artificial emotional cues, and they mainly are relying on stated preference information on alcohol use. And I think both is pretty challenging and difficult in this particular setting. And so in that sense, we were thinking that this kind of setting offers us for kind of first time the possibility to exploit real emotional cues, which are obviously evident in professional sports and also in Stuttgart, although the Swabian people are known to be a little bit less emotional maybe on average compared to others. And we observe real beer sales, not at the individual level, but at the, let's say, cash point level, which enables us somehow to relate both type of things together. But I completely agree that we need to much further elaborate on, let's say, the relevance part at the very beginning of this presentation and also in the paper. But I think at the end, it could make a kind of nice contribution to this existing literature, because they are clearly lacking reliable measures for both yet. And I think this peculiar setting can somehow, let's say, at least address these issues to some extent, although we are ending up in a single club setting. And I can tell you that it was already kind of nightmare getting this data. It took me 1.5 years actually of discussing and negotiating. I tried the best to get other clubs involved. But one thing here is that many of them are lacking in a, let's say, automated and networked cache point system in the stadium, which enables us to, let's say, get the data, reliable data for the whole stadium. And others who have it, which is the minority of clubs, were not willing at all to share it for various reasons. So in that case, probably we will end up with just having a one club example, but still I hope we can convince you later on that it's still a relevant contribution in this regard.
Still, I would like to emphasize that in science generally, the question is so, not so what. So what is what comes after the so is clear, but in our case, the so is not clear whatsoever. You can do anything about that. If we contribute to the psychological literature, you can think about therapy and stuff like that. But if you I don't know, if you ask a biologist or a physician, I don't know, the so is important. What is going on in the first place?
Yeah. Okay. Up to the point.
I mean,
yeah. No.
No one knows what's going on. We don't know if there is a correlation or causal relationship, but we need to figure that out. And if we model it clean, then we can make the statement. If not, it's not possible.
Yeah, but you still have to decide initially that there's an interesting research problem, right? And that's so. But I mean, yes, I mean the methodology is obviously important in determining the quality of the study. So I mean, one of the things that strikes me is that, I mean, it's obviously it's a very specific group of people, right? So there's some self-selection here. If I'm the kind of person who goes, particularly a German who goes to football matches, then, you know, I'm expected to drink beer. So, for example, you know, at here in Michigan, there's no alcohol sales in the stadium, right? So, although most of our students are drunk before they get into the stadium anyway. That's so. If you were here, you'd see them, you know, getting drunk very quickly. I wonder if, you know, an interesting route might not be to actually to get sales at bars, and particularly, you know, you could think of, if you did it in looking at people at bars, what people watching football matches, and you could have an excellent control because you could have a bars where they weren't watching football matches, and so you could you know, use actually the same time of data and look at how beer consumptions was affected by watching the football rather than being in some other environment.
Sure, yeah.
Oh, sorry, I muted myself. Sorry. Thank you, Stefan. Alex has got his hand up as well. I don't know if we wanted to move to Alex. That is Krumer rather than Gillett.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much for say very interesting study from the methodological point of view. I guess we all saw that you are very good in econometrics. I must agree with both of you and Stefan, because when Stefan said, so what, this is important. And when you answered, we care about so, this is a very philosophical discussion here, and kind of it's still better to motivate why it is important. But you, in a way, right. We care about finding something, and maybe other people will understand better why it is important. Still, Stefan is also right here. The so what is very important in the publishing process, at least. And
exactly, that's the system. But like the clean science part of it is first figuring out what is going on, and then someone else can build up upon this.
That is why I agreed with your answer as well.
Perfectly right. Yeah, I agree. Yeah.
Yeah. So some people may find something without really understanding the real significance, and then the others would elaborate on it as well. But on the more or less philosophical point, you kind of control for water consumption, if I understood correctly, right?
Right. Yes.
And then you say that, well, but going out towards the end of the game with a bottle of water and going out at the end of the game with the beer, I'm not sure it's the right comparison, right? So it's not really the same. I'm fine with buying water at the end of the game and going out of the stadium with the bottle of water, but I'm not sure I'm very happy to go out of the stadium with the beer. It's not really the same, isn't it?
So you're talking about the post-match sales?
Yes, because towards the end of the game, I must agree with Stefan that we reduce the consumption of beer, not because of suspense or shock or surprise, but it's the end of the game. I don't want to buy beer now. I have no time. But I don't mind to buy water. That's my point.
Okay, yeah. So post-match sales are not included. So we cut everything at the at minute 90. But you mean like minute 70 to 90 or something?
Yeah,
like
let's say I buy a bottle of water at minute 85, but I will not buy beer in the minute 85.
Okay, but if there's this is a general pattern, like you say, right? At the end of the match, there happens something. Less sales in general. Again, we have these trends in, so we capture everything that changes just with T. You know what I mean? And above that, we have the water consumption in, which models not everything, but we can control, for example, if there are less people in the stadium, because there's no control variable like spectators, match, and time specific. However, this reflects in the water consumption. If there's a general pattern going down at the end of the match, it should be in the trend and in the water consumption, with both have been significant.
Okay, and my last question here, because you kind of try to sell it as a psychological contribution, but the setting is very unique. So the alcohol consumption, when everybody observes me, because I guess that's the way we are talking about alcohol and its negative things, probably. But when people observe me and I'm in a stadium of 60,000 people, it's not really the same situation when I'm alone and I'm depressed and I drink alcohol or something like that. So in that regard, maybe the nice setting is a disadvantage, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah, I understand the point. Michael, do you want to answer?
Yeah, it's so in general, you're right. It's not the same whether you are in a crowd or privately, for example, at home. Maybe this could be an issue there. You're right. I agree with that.
Maybe I could add on, Alex. Thanks a lot. I would not say that it's a disadvantage, the peculiarity of the setting. I would just say that we need to be more precise about which type of alcohol consumption we are looking at. And we are definitely not looking at this highly problematic, individualized binge drinking behavior at home after some emotional cues or personal losses or whatsoever. We are just looking at kind of average type of pleasure drinking with friends and family in the stadium, if you're around, which is, I would say, distinctive, different from this kind of very problematic other forms of drinking. So we need to be precise, and I'm pretty confident that we find in the literature different types of alcohol consumption classifications, and then we could say for which type of drinking behavior we actually make a contribution and for which not. So I would say we need to be more sharp in this regard, but it's probably not ruling out the general reasonability behind this, I would say.
Yeah, but I agree too. Yeah, I mean, this is pretty important. You talked about this so what, and this is yeah, this is one point to have this pretty straight. Is it about this post-match violence stuff, drinking behavior, or do we contribute to another part here? Yeah, thanks.
Okay, and then we'll move to a question from the other Alex Gillette.
Hi, thank you very much for the presentation. It's not so easy to consume alcohol looking at the pitch, looking at the game in England anymore. Or at least not last time I was at my local team. But I'm thinking about when I'm thinking at an event, be it a sports event, music, whatever it is. When I think about, right, time to get another drink, whatever it is. And it's often quite it's not always the cues of what's going on in terms of suspense and excitement. It's when my attention's waning would be the main one. When a band's playing a song I'm not so bothered about, when the game's getting boring. Coupled with that is when I need the toilet from drinking. And I would think, the toilet's in that direction, the bar's next door. I need the loo after maybe 20, 30 minutes. I'll get another drink while I'm going past so I don't miss the action. So I think there's maybe some like pragmatic or practical things in there that might be worth investigating. And the third one is you mentioned about the sort of roaming beer sellers. And I think anything where you know, thinking in terms of operations or marketing at that level, anything where you're looking at kind of supply and demand for things and when people are doing it. Well, obviously, you know, I don't know how many beer sales the roaming salespeople account for, but they're there for a reason. They're not there to lose money for the club, so they must be selling something. And I'm just thinking about their movement through the crowd and how easy it is to access them and things. And I think that data would be useful if you could get it somehow to plug into this, because any spikes or dips you see might just be when they're on their break or they're into a particularly busy area of the crowd, and it makes it more difficult to access that supply line, if you like, of drinking. They may not sell that many. It may be a minor thing, certainly per seller, but I don't know. There might be 100 of these people walking through around the crowd. I hear at American sports events, the kind of in-crowd retail and roaming sort of selling is a bigger deal than it is in England anyway. So there may be a national things going on. And I don't know the German situation at all, but I think there may be some things to think about. I don't think they foul up your research in any way, but I think there might be some practical things anyone reading the research might think of when they're looking at this.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. So I just a comment to this comment. Yeah, it's true. We do not have a clue how big these transactions are from these mobile salesmen. However, the third comment and the second comment with the pragmatic decisions of fans, I would argue it's only a problem if it's not random on average. If there's a systematic deviation, then we have a problem. If not, if it's more or less the same and there's for each match, then yeah, you can argue about the sample size, of course, yeah, which is relatively small then. But the first question is it random or not? And if it is, then we shouldn't have a problem modeling wise. Yeah.
I just wondered if you needed a bladder capacity variable in your sum somewhere, but maybe not in that case.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Alex. I have a childcare constraint binding this week, so I am going to wrap up with 10 minutes still on the clock. If you do have further questions and comments that you do want to ask Michael or Lukas or Tim about their research, you can put them in the chat and they'll still be able to see them later, or you can drop them emails. If you don't have their addresses, then get in touch with me and I will happily pass them on, pass your questions on to them. But thank you very much, Lukas and Michael, for a really interesting presentation, well executed, generating some interesting comments. Looks like some really good research, and I look forward to seeing it as it develops further. Thanks once again, everyone, for your attendance. We return virtually to Tübingen next week when Georgios Nilbantis presents Exploring the Causal Effects of Marketing Events, an application to exhibition games in football. So have a great weekend, everybody, and we'll see you again next week.
Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, and bye.
Have a nice day. Ciao, ciao.